All right, so let's dive in and imagine. Just imagine a new drug hitting the market right. It's been deemed safe, effective, got all the approvals, everything, the whole 9 yards. You'd think that's it, right? End of story.
Oh, not even close. It's really just the beginning of a whole other chapter. This is where post-marketing surveillance comes in.
Post-marketing surveillance. Okay, so fill me in here. What exactly is that all about? What does that actually involve?
Well, in the simplest terms, it's kind of like an ongoing safety check. You see, the FDA, they don't just stop watching a drug once it's approved.
Really?
Yeah, they keep gathering information, making sure it's still doing what it should, being safe for everyone out there in the real world, all the different kinds of people using it.
That's interesting. So it's not just a one-and-done kind of deal. Why is that?
You got to think about it this way. Those initial clinical trials, while super important, they only involve a limited number of people.
Right.
And often under very specific conditions.
Yeah, makes sense.
Post-marketing surveillance, on the other hand, that lets us see how a drug really works out in the wild, so to speak.
Out in the real world.
Exactly, with thousands, even millions of different patients using it in their everyday lives.
Oh, wow. So you're saying it's like a real-world test.
Exactly. And sometimes you find things you wouldn't expect, side effects that didn't show up in the smaller trials, long-term effects that take a while to emerge, how the drug interacts with other medications people might be taking.
So things that just don't show up until you have that wide range of people using it.
Precisely. And it's all crucial stuff.
Okay, so let's break down this whole post-marketing surveillance system a bit more. What are some of the key parts of this?
Well, first off, there's pharmacovigilance, which is just a fancy word for, drug safety monitoring.
Pharmacovigilance.
Pharmacovigilance.
Okay, so that sounds pretty intense.
It's really not as complicated as it sounds. Think of it this way. If you ever, notice a weird side effect from a medication and you tell your doctor about it, or maybe even report it directly to the FDA, you're participating in pharmacovigilance.
Wow, I never actually thought about it that way. So every time someone reports something unusual, they're actually part of this whole system.
You got it. It's a real team effort. And speaking of reporting, closely tied to pharmacovigilance is this idea of adverse event reporting.
Adverse event reporting. So what exactly is an adverse event? Because that sounds kind of, I don't know, scary.
Yeah, it's really not that scary when you break it down. An adverse event is basically any unwanted or unexpected medical occurrence that happens after someone takes a drug. Now, important to remember, it doesn't necessarily mean the drug actually caused it. It just means it happened after the drug was taken.
Okay, so just to be clear, even if it's not 100% certain that the drug caused the problem, it's still reported.
You got it. Every report, it all gets added to this huge database that the FDA keeps. And then analysts, they go through all of it. They're looking for any patterns, anything unusual that might point to a safety issue with a particular medication.
So it's kind of like a giant puzzle, and each report is a new piece, right? And they're putting it all together to see what the picture looks like.
That's a great way to put it. And then if they do spot a potential problem, the FDA has a whole bunch of options, They might update the drug's label, like adding warnings about potential side effects. They might ask the drug company to do more studies to get a better picture of what's going on. And sometimes, in some cases, they can actually pull the drug off the market entirely.
Wow. So it's serious business. It's not just about collecting information. They actually take action based on what they find.
Absolutely. The whole goal is to keep patients safe and to make sure that the medications, that we're all using are being used as effectively and safely as possible. And another important part of this whole system is something called risk management plans.
Risk management plans. Break that down for me.
Think of them as a safety blueprint. They're designed by drug companies to kind of minimize any potential risks that might come with their medications. So let's say there's this drug, right? And it has a known risk of causing liver problems.
Okay. Yeah, that sounds pretty serious.
The risk management plan might include things like, regular blood tests to keep an eye on liver function, maybe even some special educational materials for doctors and patients explaining the risks and what to watch out for, any signs of trouble.
So it's like they're not just waiting for something bad to happen. They're trying to prevent those problems in the first place.
You got it. And this is where things get even more interesting. Sometimes the FDA, they don't just stop at requiring a risk management plan. They might actually require drug companies to do more studies, even after a drug's already on the market.
Wait, so they can make a drug company do more research even after the drug's been approved? Why would they do that?
Sometimes there just isn't enough information from those initial trials. to really understand the long-term effects or how it works in certain groups of people. For instance, maybe they need to study it specifically in children or pregnant women, groups that might not have been included in those original trials.
Okay, so it's like, hey, we need more data before we're totally comfortable with this drug being used widely.
Exactly. These post-marketing studies, they can be really important for, filling in those gaps and making sure that medications are safe and effective for everyone who might use them.
So it's a never-ending quest for knowledge, always learning more, refining the understanding.
That's a great way to put it. And, speaking of specific groups and ongoing research, there's this law that plays a huge role here, the Pediatric Research Equity Act, PREA for short.
PREA, yeah, that rings a bell. That has something to do with the kids, right?
You got it. PREA is all about making sure that medications are studied and tested in children, not just adults. And we're back, diving deeper into post-marketing surveillance and all its ins and outs.
Picking up right where we left off, talking about how the FDA makes sure medications stay safe and effective, once they're actually out there being used.
Right, exactly. And, a big part of that, as we were just saying, is PREA, the Pediatric Research Equity Act.
Right, PREA. So remind me, why is this such a big deal? Why a whole law just for testing drugs in kids?
Well, for a long time, kids were often left out of clinical trials. Researchers, they were worried about the ethics of it all, testing new drugs on kids.
Yeah, makes sense. They're more vulnerable.
Yeah.
But, if you don't test on kids, how do doctors know how much to give them? Or even if a drug's safe for them at all?
That's the gap PREA was meant to fill. It basically says, look, if a drug is meant to be used in children, the company that makes it has to study it in kids specifically. Can't just assume what works for adults will work for them too.
Makes sense. Kids' bodies are different, right? They process drugs differently. They might be more sensitive to certain side effects.
Exactly. PREA gets that, Children aren't just tiny adults. Their needs are different when it comes to medication, and those needs have to be considered from the get-go.
So it's not just safety, it's making sure the drug actually works for kids, not just that it's, not actively harming them.
Absolutely. That's why PREA has been such a game changer in pediatric medicine. It's really pushed for more research on how drugs affect children. Safer, more effective treatments.
That's amazing to think how much this one law has changed things for kids' health.
It really has. And it all comes back to this idea of post-marketing surveillance, right? This constant process of learning, adapting, and refining how we understand these medications as they're used in the real world.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground. Pharmacovigilance, reporting those adverse events, the whole risk management plan thing, now PREA. Seems like the FDA has a lot of tools to keep an eye on these medications.
They do, that's for sure. And one of the most powerful tools they have is the post-marketing study.
Oh, yeah, we talked about those a little earlier. Those are the studies that the FDA can require drug companies to do, even after the drug is already out there, right?
Exactly. And they come in different forms, each with its own purpose. One you might hear about is the observational study.
Observational. So they're just watching. Like, scientists observing animals in their natural habitat.
That's a pretty good analogy, actually. In an observational study, researchers are tracking patients who are already taking a particular medication, just in their everyday lives, They're not controlling anything, just observing what happens.
So it's like a real-world snapshot of how that drug's being used and what the results are.
You got it. Observational studies can be really helpful for understanding those long-term effects, how a medication interacts with other drugs people might be taking, how it works in different groups of people.
So, like getting a bigger picture of the drug's performance beyond those controlled trials from earlier.
Now, another type of post-marketing study is the interventional study.
Interventional. That sounds a little more, hands-on.
It is. Interventional studies, they're more like those classic clinical trials. But the difference is they happen after a drug is already approved and available.
So they're still putting patients into different groups, comparing the results like in those earlier stages of drug development.
Exactly. But the purpose, it might be different. Maybe they're comparing that drug to a newer treatment or looking at different doses, different ways to give the medication.
So fine-tuning things based on what they're seeing out in the real world.
Exactly. And then there's a special kind of interventional study called a phase 4 trial.
Wait, phase 4? I remember hearing about phase 1, 2, and 3. What's this phase 4 all about?
You can think of phase 4 trials as the long game of drug research. They're typically big, long-term studies. Thousands of patients followed for years.
Years, huh? That's dedication.
It is, but these studies can reveal a lot of important information. Long-term safety, effectiveness, stuff that just wouldn't come up in those shorter trials.
Like rare side effects, maybe.
Yeah.
Or benefits that take a while to show up.
You got it. It's about getting a full picture of the drug, how it works over the long haul.
So all this data, the observations, the interventions, the phase 4 trials, it all goes back to the FDA.
It does, and they use it to make some big decisions. Maybe update the drug label, add some new warnings, change the recommended dose, even take the drug off the market if it needs to happen.
So it's all very dynamic, constantly evolving as new information comes to light.
And here's something I think you'll find really interesting. You, the listener, you play a big role in all this.
Me? How so? I'm not a scientist or anything.
But you're a patient, or maybe you know someone who is. Every time you report a side effect to your doctor or to the FDA directly, you're adding to this whole safety surveillance system.
Wow, I never thought of it like that. So we're all part of this safety net, looking out for each other.
Exactly. It's all of us working together to make sure the medications we rely on are as safe and effective as possible.
We've talked a lot about safety, but these post-marketing studies, they're not just about finding risks, are they?
You're right. Sometimes they can actually uncover new benefits. Unexpected ones, even.
Really? So a drug that was approved for one thing might actually help with something else completely?
Precisely. That's where we get off-label use.
Off-label use. That always sounded kind of mysterious to me. What does that actually mean?
Off-label use, it's just when a doctor prescribes a medication for something other than what it was originally approved for by the FDA.
So a doctor might prescribe something for a different reason than what's on the label.
That's right. And while it might sound risky, off-label prescribing happens all the time. It can be totally legitimate. Sometimes the evidence for off-label use is very strong, based on lots of studies and years of experience.
So those post-marketing studies can lead to new ways to use existing medications.
It's like, opening up all these new treatment possibilities.
This deep dive has been fascinating. It's
Yeah.
really made me appreciate all the complexity involved in drug safety. It's not just approved, done. It's an ongoing process.
A journey of monitoring, evaluation, refinement. And as we've seen, it's a journey we're all on together.
That's a great point. But it also makes me think about something else. We've been talking about the science, the data, but what about the ethics of all this?
That's a really important question, one we need to think carefully about. We've talked about drug companies having to do these extra studies after a drug is approved, but what about the patients in those studies? They're taking on some risk, even if it's small, and they might not get any direct benefit.
Right, they're participating for the greater good in a way. So how do we make sure these studies are ethical, done in a way that respects the people involved?
Yeah, that's a big question. It's complicated, right? There's no easy answer. But I think, transparency has to be a huge part of it.
Oh, absolutely. Patients, they need to know what they're getting into, the risks, any possible benefits of being in a study, and they have to understand it's their choice,
Right.
They can say no anytime, no pressure, no penalty.
Right. It's their decision, their health.
It's about respecting that, their autonomy,
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Informed consent, that's crucial in any medical research, especially when you're talking about folks who are already taking a medication and might not be, actively seeking treatment for a specific condition.
And it's not just about getting consent, it's making sure they get it. You know what I mean? That they understand what they're signing up for.
Exactly. The information's got to be clear, easy to understand, no jargon, none of that technical stuff.
And what about, for more vulnerable groups, is there a risk of them feeling pressured, like they have to participate?
That's a really good point. We need to make sure people aren't feeling coerced, worried they'll lose access to care if they don't participate, or feeling like they have to say yes because of their doctor.
So it's about making sure everyone feels empowered to make their own choices with all the information they need.
Exactly. And that's really, I think, at the core of ethical research, right? Respect for the individual, recognizing that every patient is a person with their own needs and values and treating them that way.
Well said. This whole conversation, it's really made me think about post-marketing surveillance in a new way. It's not just the science, it's the human side of it too.
That's such a good point. And it's something we have to remember as we keep working on these systems, making them better. It's a balance, getting the data we need to keep drugs safe while still doing things the right way ethically.
Finding that middle ground, right?
Right.
Where science and well-being, they meet.
Yeah. That's it. And I think that's a good place to wrap up our deep dive.
On post-marketing surveillance.
It's a complex topic with a lot of moving parts, always changing. Hopefully, this has given everyone listening a better understanding of how it all works, the challenges, and the ethics involved.
And as always, stay curious, keep asking those questions, be part of the conversation about the future of medicine.
Absolutely.
Thanks for joining us on the Deep Dive. We'll catch you next time.